The morning I discovered my wife was planning to steal my company, I was eating cereal and watching her practice her concerned wife face in the reflection of her coffee mug. At 45, I'd built TechFlow Solutions from nothing, a basement startup that now employed 200 people and generated $30 million annually. But watching Clara perfect that expression, I realized she'd been rehearsing for my funeral while I was still breathing. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. "Jack, honey, you look tired," she said, not looking up from her phone. Classic Clara, fake concern delivered with the warmth of a tax audit. "Thanks, sweetheart. Nothing says good morning like being told I look like death." I spooned another bite of cereal, watching her thumb dance across the screen. "Texting Rita again? What's the gossip today? Whose marriage is imploding this week?" Clara's perfectly manicured fingers paused. "Just business stuff." Business stuff. Right. Because Clara's idea of business was lunching with other wealthy wives and complaining about their husbands' lack of ambition. She'd quit practicing law 5 years ago when my company took off, claiming she wanted to support my dreams. What she really wanted was access to my bank account and the social status that came with being married to a successful tech entrepreneur. "Dad, can you drive me to school?" Jenna appeared in the kitchen doorway, 17, and radiating the kind of confidence I wished I'd had at her age. "Mom's too busy with her business stuff." The air quotes weren't lost on anyone. Jenna had inherited my sarcasm and Clara's intelligence, a dangerous combination that made her see through people's bullshit with surgical precision. "Sure, kiddo. Where's your brother?" "Max is already outside. He's been weird lately. Keeps asking if you and Mom are getting divorced." Clara's head snapped up. "Why would he ask that?" "Maybe because you and Simon Lane have been working together an awful lot," Jenna said, making those air quotes again. "And Simon's Porsche has been in our driveway more than Dad's car." Simon Lane, 39 years old, silver-haired, drove a black Porsche like it was an extension of his ego. He'd introduced himself as a business consultant 6 months ago, offering to help Clara explore investment opportunities. What he was really exploring was my wife, but I'd been too busy running my company to pay attention to the obvious signs. "Simon is helping me with some projects," Clara said, her voice tight. "What kind of projects?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Because last I checked, your biggest project was deciding between the country club's salmon or chicken for next month's charity luncheon. You don't take me seriously, Jack. You never have." There it was. The victim card. Clara wielded it like a master swordsman, turning every conversation into evidence of my inadequacy as a husband. But this morning, something felt different. Her performance seemed more calculated, like she was building a case. "I take you plenty seriously," I said, standing to rinse my bowl. "I took you seriously when you said you wanted to quit law to support my career. I took you seriously when you said you needed your own credit cards for household expenses. I even took you seriously when you said Simon was just a friend. He is just a friend. Right. And I'm just a tech entrepreneur who happens to be married to a woman who spends more time with her friend than her husband." Jenna grabbed an apple from the counter. "Can we go? This is getting uncomfortable, and I've got a chemistry test." As we walked to my car, I noticed Simon's Porsche wasn't in the driveway for once. Small mercies. Max was already in the passenger seat, earbuds in, staring at his phone with the intensity of a 15-year-old trying to solve the mysteries of the universe. "Morning, buddy," I said, starting the engine. He pulled out one earbud. "Dad, are you and Mom okay?" The question hit me harder than I expected. Max was the sensitive one, the kid who noticed everything but said little. If he was asking directly, things were worse than I thought. "We're working through some stuff," I said, which was the most honest answer I could give without traumatizing him. Is it because of that Simon guy? He's kind of a jerk. What makes you say that? He talks to Mom like she's stupid, but she doesn't seem to notice. And he asked me weird questions about your company last week. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. What kind of questions? Like how many employees you have, what kind of contracts you work on, stuff like that. I told him to ask you directly. Smart kid. But the fact that Simon was pumping my son for information about my business sent ice through my veins. This wasn't just an affair. This was something bigger. After dropping the kids at school, I drove to the office with my mind racing. Tech Flow Solutions occupied 3 floors of a glass building in the tech corridor outside Boston. I'd started the company in my basement 7 years ago, writing code and living on ramen noodles. Now we had government contracts, corporate clients, and enough revenue to make me genuinely wealthy. But wealth, I was learning, made you a target. Victor Reeves, my head of IT and closest friend, was waiting in my office with 2 cups of coffee and his usual expression of barely contained cynicism. "You look like hell," he said, handing me a cup. "So I've been told. Clara's concerned about my appearance. Clara's concerned about a lot of things lately, like why the company's financial records keep getting accessed from outside IP addresses." I nearly dropped my coffee. "What?" "Started about 3 months ago. Someone's been poking around our books, but they're good, covering their tracks, using VPNs. If I hadn't been running extra security protocols, I might not have noticed." 3 months ago, right around the time Simon Lane entered our lives. "Can you trace it?" "Working on it. But Jack, there's something else. Clara's been asking me technical questions about the company's structure, shareholding agreements, that kind of thing. She said you asked her to look into it." "I never asked her to look into anything." Victor's expression darkened. "That's what I figured. So either your wife is suddenly interested in corporate law, or someone's coaching her." The pieces were falling into place, and I didn't like the picture they were forming. Clara and Simon weren't just having an affair. They were planning something that involved my company. "I need you to do me a favor," I said. "Can you monitor all access to our systems? I want to know every time someone looks at our files, from where and when." "Already on it. But Jack, if they're planning what I think they're planning, you need to be careful. Corporate theft is serious business." I spent the rest of the day trying to focus on work, but my mind kept drifting to Clara's behavior over the past few months. The late-night phone calls, the sudden interest in our finances, the way she'd been pushing me to update my will, just to be safe. That evening, I came home to find Clara in the kitchen, cooking dinner, something she hadn't done in months. She was wearing a dress I'd bought her for our anniversary, the one she claimed made her look fat. "You're home early," she said, not looking up from the stove. "Wanted to spend time with my family. Is that okay with you?" "Of course, I made your favorite, pot roast." Pot roast. The same meal she'd cooked the night before she asked me to co-sign the loan for her sister's failed boutique. The same meal she'd made when she wanted me to agree to the country club membership. Clara's pot roast was her equivalent of a Trojan horse. "What's the occasion?" I asked, loosening my tie. "Can't a wife cook for her husband without having an ulterior motive?" "She can, but you usually don't." Clara turned to face me, and for a moment I saw something flicker across her face. Guilt, maybe, or calculation. "Jack, I've been thinking. We should update some of our legal documents. Estate planning, corporate structure, that sort of thing." There it was. The real reason for the pot roast. What brought this on? Simon mentioned that a lot of successful entrepreneurs don't have proper succession plans. If something happened to you, I wouldn't know how to run the company. "Nothing's going to happen to me, Clara." "But if it did, the company would go to the kids, like we discussed when we set up the trust." Her smile faltered slightly. "But I'm your wife. Shouldn't I have some say in the business?" "You do. You're listed as a beneficiary, but Clara, you don't know anything about running a tech company." I could learn. Simon thinks I'd be good at it. Simon thinks. Everything came back to Simon these days. I'm sure Simon has lots of opinions about my company, I said carefully. But our legal documents are fine as they are. Jack, please. I just want to make sure we're protected. The desperation in her voice was new. Clara was usually subtle in her manipulations, but tonight she seemed rushed, almost panicked. Protected from what? From complications, legal issues. You know how messy these things can get. I studied my wife's face, looking for the woman I'd married 18 years ago. She'd been different then, ambitious, sharp, driven. She'd had her own career, her own goals, but somewhere along the way, she'd become someone I didn't recognize. Someone who saw me as a means to an end rather than a partner. I'll think about it, I said finally. Relief flooded her features. Thank you. Simon knows a good lawyer who specializes in corporate restructuring. Of course he did. That night, after Clara fell asleep, I crept into her home office. She'd always been meticulous about her paperwork, filing everything in labeled folders with obsessive precision. But tonight, I wasn't looking for organization. I was looking for secrets. I found them in a folder marked Investment Research. Inside were printouts of TechFlow's corporate structure, our client list, financial projections, and something that made my blood run cold. A draft document titled Emergency Succession Plan, with my forged signature at the bottom. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. In the event of my death or incapacitation, control of TechFlow would transfer to Clara as my surviving spouse. But there was a clause I'd never seen before, one that allowed her to bring in a managing partner to help run the company. 3 guesses who that managing partner would be. I photographed every document with my phone, my hands shaking with rage. They weren't just planning to steal my company. They were planning to do it legally, using forged documents and my wife's position as my heir. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated me. I'd built TechFlow from nothing, survived the dot-com crash, weathered recessions, and outmaneuvered competitors who had more money and better connections. I wasn't about to let my cheating wife and her smooth-talking boyfriend destroy everything I'd worked for. If Clara and Simon wanted to play games, I'd show them how a real entrepreneur fought back. The war was about to begin. The next morning, I arrived at the office early, my mind sharp with purpose. Victor was already at his desk, surrounded by empty coffee cups and the glow of multiple monitors. Please tell me you have good news, I said, settling into the chair beside his desk. Define good. I traced those external access attempts. Want to guess where they're coming from? Simon Lane's office? Close. They're bouncing through several VPNs, but the original IP traces back to a law firm downtown. Fenton, Krasner, and Associates. High-end corporate attorneys who specialize in hostile takeovers. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Clara mentioned a lawyer yesterday, said Simon knew someone who specialized in corporate restructuring. That would be Margaret Fenton. She's got a reputation for creative interpretations of corporate law, the kind of lawyer you hire when you want to do something technically legal but morally questionable. I pulled out my phone and showed Victor the photos I'd taken from Clara's office. His face grew darker with each image. Jesus, Jack. They're not just planning to steal your company, they're planning to do it with forged documents. This is fraud. Can you prove the signature is forged? Easily. But the question is, what do you want to do about it? We could go to the police, but corporate fraud cases take years to resolve. In the meantime, they could do serious damage to the company. I leaned back in my chair, considering my options. The smart play would be to lawyer up, file charges, and let the legal system handle it. But the legal system was slow, and I had employees depending on me, contracts to fulfill, and a business to protect. I want to handle this my way, I said finally. Victor raised an eyebrow. What does that mean? It means Clara and Simon want to play games, so we're going to play. But we're going to play by my rules. The first step was gathering intelligence. Over the next week, I became a detective in my own life, documenting every suspicious phone call, every unexplained absence, every lie Clara told. I installed security cameras in my home office and began recording our conversations. What I discovered was worse than I'd imagined. Clara wasn't just planning to steal my company, she was actively working to undermine it. She'd been feeding confidential information to Simon, who was using it to approach our clients with competing bids through a shell company he'd established. But the most damning evidence came from a phone conversation I recorded between Clara and her sister Rita. "Simon says we need to move fast," Clara said, pacing around our kitchen while I pretended to read in the next room. "Jack's getting suspicious." "Are you sure about this?" Rita's voice came through the speakerphone. "I mean, it's Jack's company. He built it from nothing. And now it's worth $30 million. Do you know what I could do with that kind of money?" "But what if he finds out?" "He won't. Simon's lawyer says the documents are bulletproof. Once Jack signs the succession plan, we'll be in control. And if Jack becomes a problem, well, accidents happen." The casual way she said it, "accidents happen," sent ice through my veins. This wasn't just corporate theft anymore. Clara was talking about eliminating me entirely. That night, I confronted her. "We need to talk," I said, finding her in the bedroom, getting ready for another business dinner with Simon. "Can it wait? I'm meeting Simon to discuss those legal documents." "Actually, that's exactly what I want to talk about." She turned to face me, and I saw something I'd never seen before in her eyes. Fear. "I know what you're planning, Clara." "I don't know what you mean." "I know about the forged documents. I know about Simon's shell company. I know about the clients you've been feeding information to." Her face went white. "Jack, I can explain." "Can you? Can you explain why my wife is planning to steal my company and feed confidential information to her boyfriend?" "Simon isn't my boyfriend." "Right. He's just a friend who happens to spend more time in our house than I do, who's helping you commit corporate fraud, and who you've been screwing for the past 6 months. Clara's composure cracked. "You don't understand. You've never appreciated what I bring to this marriage. I gave up my career for you." "You gave up your career because you were a mediocre lawyer who saw an easier path to wealth through marriage." "How dare you! How dare I! Clara, you're planning to steal my life's work, and you're asking how I dare call you out on it." She straightened her shoulders, and suddenly the mask dropped completely. The loving wife act disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. "You're right," she said quietly. "I am planning to take control of TechFlow, because you don't deserve it. You think you're so smart, so successful, but you're just a glorified code monkey who got lucky. And Simon? What's his role in this? Simon's a real businessman. He knows how to maximize value, how to make strategic decisions. Under his management, TechFlow could be worth $100 million. Under his management, TechFlow would be gutted and sold for parts within a year. We'll see about that." The next morning, I arrived at the office to find Clara and Simon waiting in the conference room with Margaret Fenton, the lawyer Victor had identified. Fenton was exactly what I'd expected. Mid-50s, sharp suit, eyes like a shark. "Mr. Harlow," Fenton said, not bothering to stand, "I think it's time we had a frank discussion about your company's future. I think it's time you got the hell out of my building." "Now, Jack," Simon said, his voice smooth as silk, "there's no need for hostility. We're all on the same side here." "Are we? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're trying to steal my company." "Steal is such an ugly word," Fenton interjected. "We prefer to think of it as succession planning." She slid a stack of documents across the table. "These papers will formalize the transfer of operational control to Clara in the event of your death or incapacitation. It's really quite reasonable." I glanced at the papers without touching them. "And if I refuse to sign?" Clara leaned forward. Then you'll regret it, Jack. I know things about this company, about your business practices, that could cause serious problems if they became public. What kind of problems? The kind that involve federal investigations and criminal charges. It was a bluff. It had to be. I'd run TechFlow completely above board, paid every tax, followed every regulation. But the threat was clear. Sign the papers or face a campaign of lies and legal harassment that could destroy both me and the company. I looked around the table at the three people who were trying to steal my life's work. Clara, the wife who'd promised to love and support me. Simon, the predator who'd seen an opportunity and taken it. And Fenton, the lawyer who'd found a way to make theft look legal. You know what? I said, reaching for a pen. You're right. This is reasonable. I signed every document they put in front of me, my signature neat and clear on each page. Clara smiled triumphantly. Simon looked smug. Fenton looked satisfied. They had no idea what they'd just done. Excellent, Fenton said, gathering the papers. These will be filed with the appropriate authorities immediately. Congratulations, Clara. You're now the operational head of TechFlow Solutions. There's just one small problem, I said, standing up. What's that? Simon asked. The documents you just had me sign? They're not worth the paper they're printed on. Clara's smile faltered. What do you mean? I mean that 3 days ago I restructured the entire company. TechFlow Solutions is now a subsidiary of Harlow Holdings, LLC, which is owned by a trust controlled by my children. The company you just took control of has no assets, no contracts, and no employees. The color drained from Clara's face. That's impossible. Is it? Victor, would you mind bringing in our guests? The conference room door opened, and Victor entered with 3 men in suits. My real lawyer, an FBI agent, and a representative from the Massachusetts Attorney General's office. Clara Harlow, Simon Lane, the FBI agent said, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit corporate fraud, identity theft, and violation of federal computer crime statutes. As the handcuffs clicked around Clara's wrists, she looked at me with pure hatred. You bastard, she hissed. You planned this. I learned from the best, I replied. You taught me that in marriage, just like in business, you should always read the fine print. Simon tried to run but didn't make it past the elevator. Fenton, interestingly, had disappeared the moment the FBI arrived. Apparently, her legal ethics had limits after all. That afternoon, I sat in my office, watching the news vans gather in the parking lot. The story was already breaking. Local tech entrepreneur foils wife's corporate theft plot. It would be a media circus for weeks, but I didn't care. I'd saved my company, protected my employees, and exposed the people who'd tried to destroy everything I'd built. But more importantly, I'd learned something about myself. When pushed to the wall, I was capable of more than I'd ever imagined. The war wasn't over. Clara and Simon would make bail, hire new lawyers, and try to spin this as a misunderstanding. But they'd made one fatal mistake. They'd underestimated Jack Harlow. And that was a mistake they'd never get the chance to make again. 3 days after Clara's arrest, I was sitting in my kitchen, drinking coffee and reading the morning news coverage of what the Boston Globe had dubbed the TechFlow conspiracy, when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Rita, Clara's sister and former confidant, standing on my porch with the expression of someone who'd just discovered her lottery ticket was a fake. Hello, Rita, I said, opening the door but not inviting her in. Jack, we need to talk. Do we? Because last I checked, you were part of the conspiracy to steal my company. Her face crumpled. I didn't know it would go this far. Clara said it was just about protecting the family's interests. Whose family? Because last I checked, Clara was planning to cut me out entirely. Rita shifted uncomfortably. The kids need their mother, Jack. Jenna and Max are devastated. She was right about that. The past few days had been hell for my children. Jenna had been furious, not at me but at Clara for lying to her. Max had withdrawn completely, spending most of his time in his room playing video games and avoiding the reporters who'd been camping outside our house. The kids need stability, I said. They need to know that actions have consequences and that their father won't let people walk all over him. Clara made a mistake. Clara committed multiple felonies. There's a difference. Rita's shoulders sagged. What do you want from me, Jack? I want you to stay away from my family. I want you to stop calling my children and trying to convince them that their mother is a victim. And I want you to understand that if you ever try to interfere in my life again, I'll make sure the FBI knows about your role in this whole mess. Her eyes widened. I didn't do anything illegal. Didn't you? Because I have recordings of you and Clara discussing the forged documents, the client information theft, and what you called my inevitable accident. Want to test whether the FBI considers that conspiracy? Rita left without another word. The truth was, I was bluffing about Rita's legal exposure. She'd been stupid and greedy, but not technically criminal. But I was done playing defense. Clara and Simon had declared war on my family, and I was going to win it decisively. My first target was Simon's reputation. Through Victor's research, I'd learned that Simon Lane wasn't just a business consultant. He was a serial corporate parasite who specialized in seducing wealthy women and manipulating them into giving him access to their husbands' businesses. Clara wasn't his first victim. She was just his most successful one. Over the past 5 years, Simon had been involved in 3 similar schemes. In each case, he'd romanced a wealthy wife, convinced her to help him gain access to confidential business information, and then used that information to either steal clients or attempt hostile takeovers. 2 of the previous schemes had failed when the husbands caught on. The third had succeeded, resulting in a family-owned restaurant chain being sold to one of Simon's shell companies for a fraction of its value. But Simon had made a crucial mistake with me. He'd underestimated my technical resources and overestimated his own cleverness. I've got everything, Victor told me, spreading printouts across my office conference table. Bank records showing payments from Simon's shell companies to Clara. Email threads discussing client targeting. Even security camera footage of Simon photographing documents in your home office. How did you get security camera footage from my house? You installed cameras last month, remember? Motion activated, cloud storage. Simon triggered them 3 different times when he thought no one was home. I studied the footage on Victor's laptop. There was Simon, clear as day, using his phone to photograph documents from my desk. In one particularly damning clip, he was on speakerphone with someone, presumably his lawyer, discussing neutralizing the husband problem. This is enough to put him away for years, I said. Maybe, but corporate espionage cases are complicated, and Simon's got money for good lawyers. Plus, he made bail yesterday. That was troubling news. Simon out of jail meant Simon with the freedom to cause more problems. What about civil remedies? Victor grinned. Now you're thinking like a businessman. I've been researching Simon's financial situation. Turns out Mr. Smooth doesn't actually have as much money as he pretends. Most of his wealth is leveraged, expensive cars on lease, luxury apartment he can barely afford, investment portfolio that's mostly borrowed money. So if we hit him with a big enough civil lawsuit, we could wipe him out completely, and I have an idea for how to make it even better. Victor's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of just suing Simon for corporate espionage, we would also sue him for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and intentional interference with business relationships. But the real genius was in the timing. Simon's got a presentation next week at the New England Tech Conference, Victor explained. He's scheduled to speak about innovative partnership strategies in the digital age. Want to guess what company he's been using as his primary case study? TechFlow. Bingo! He's planning to present our client acquisition strategies, our proprietary development processes, and our financial projections as examples of his consulting expertise. I felt a familiar surge of anger. Simon wasn't content with trying to steal my company. He was going to use my own business model to build his reputation as a consultant. Can we stop him? Better than that. we can let him hang himself. The plan required careful coordination. First, Victor would hack into the conference's presentation system, not to cause damage, but to monitor what Simon was planning to show. Second, we would prepare a detailed legal response documenting every piece of proprietary information Simon was planning to steal. And third, we would make sure the right people were in the audience when Simon gave his presentation. Who counts as the right people? Tech journalists, potential clients, FBI agents investigating corporate espionage, and maybe a few of Simon's previous victims. I liked Victor's thinking. The New England Tech Conference was held at the Boston Convention Center, a massive glass and steel structure that hosted everything from comic book conventions to medical conferences. The Tech Conference was one of the smaller events, but it attracted serious players, startup founders, venture capitalists, corporate executives, and the journalists who covered them. Simon's presentation was scheduled for 2 p.m. in Conference Room B, a mid-sized space that could hold about 200 people. By 1:45, the room was packed, not because Simon was a particularly compelling speaker, but because word had gotten out that something interesting might happen. I sat in the back row, wearing a baseball cap and dark glasses, feeling like a spy in a bad movie. Victor was in the front row with a laptop, ready to document everything. Scattered throughout the audience were the people we'd invited: 2 FBI agents, a reporter from TechCrunch, 3 executives from companies Simon had previously targeted, and Clara's divorce attorney, who was very interested in documenting Simon's assets and income sources. At exactly 2 p.m., Simon took the stage. He looked confident, polished, every inch the successful consultant. His presentation slides were professional, his speaking style smooth and engaging. If I hadn't known he was a fraud, I might have been impressed. Today, I want to share with you a case study in innovative partnership strategies, Simon began, clicking to his first slide. Over the past year, I've been working with a mid-sized tech company to optimize their client acquisition and retention processes. The slide showed TechFlow's logo and a summary of our business model. Through careful analysis and strategic restructuring, we were able to increase client satisfaction by 30% and boost revenue by 40%. Every word was a lie. Simon had never worked with TechFlow in any official capacity. The improvements he was claiming credit for were the result of 2 years of hard work by my team. But the real bombshell came when Simon clicked to his next slide. A detailed breakdown of TechFlow's client list, including contract values, renewal dates, and strategic priorities. As you can see, Simon continued, the key to success in the modern tech landscape is understanding your client's long-term needs and positioning yourself as an indispensable partner. I pulled out my phone and texted Victor, "Now." Victor's fingers flew across his laptop keyboard. Within seconds, Simon's presentation screen flickered and changed. Instead of his prepared slides, the screen now showed a different presentation, one Victor had prepared. The title slide read, "Corporate Espionage and Fraud, a Case Study in Criminal Consulting." Simon stopped mid-sentence, staring at the screen in confusion. He clicked his remote, but nothing happened. Victor had taken complete control of the presentation system. The next slide showed security camera footage of Simon photographing documents in my home office. The slide after that showed bank records documenting payments from Simon's shell companies to Clara. Then came email threads, phone transcripts, and a detailed timeline of the conspiracy. The audience was riveted. Phones came out as people started recording. The TechCrunch reporter was typing furiously on his laptop. Simon tried to regain control. "There seems to be a technical malfunction." "No malfunction," I said, standing up and removing my baseball cap. "Just the truth." A murmur went through the crowd as people recognized me. The TechFlow story had been big news in Boston's tech community. "Ladies and gentlemen," I continued, walking toward the stage, "I'd like you to meet Simon Lane, corporate spy, serial fraudster, and the man who tried to steal my company with the help of my ex-wife." Simon's face had gone white. "This is harassment! Security!" But security wasn't coming. The FBI agents in the audience were more interested in the evidence Victor was displaying than in protecting Simon from embarrassment. "Mr. Lane," one of the agents called out, "we'd like to have a word with you." Simon tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The conference room had only one exit, and it was blocked by a crowd of very interested observers. As the FBI agents approached the stage, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I'd experienced in business. This wasn't just about protecting my company anymore, it was about justice. "You should have picked an easier target," I told Simon as the agents led him away. "But I appreciate you underestimating me. It made this so much more satisfying." The aftermath was swift and decisive. The TechCrunch article went live within hours, complete with video footage of Simon's presentation disaster. By evening, the story had been picked up by major news outlets. Simon's consulting business was finished, his reputation destroyed, his financial backers fleeing. But the real victory came 2 days later, when Clara's lawyer called. "My client would like to discuss a plea agreement," he said. "I'm listening." Full confession, complete cooperation with the FBI investigation, and agreement to a divorce settlement that leaves her with minimal assets. In exchange for reduced charges and the possibility of serving her sentence in minimum security. I thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. "Deal. But I have one additional condition." "What's that?" "She signs a statement admitting that she lied about my business practices, that she conspired with Simon to steal proprietary information, and that she forged my signature on multiple documents. I want it notarized, filed with the court, and made part of the public record." There was a long pause. "She won't like that." "She doesn't have to like it. She just has to do it." Clara signed the statement the next day. That evening, I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where Clara had served me pot roast and tried to manipulate me into signing away my life's work, and opened a beer. Jenna and Max were at the table, doing homework and pretending they weren't listening to my phone calls with lawyers. "Dad?" Jenna said, looking up from her chemistry textbook. "Yeah? Are you okay? I mean, really okay?" I considered the question. My marriage was over. My wife was going to prison. My family was broken. The media was still camped outside my house. But my company was safe, my children were with me, and the people who'd tried to destroy my life were facing the consequences of their actions. "I'm better than okay, kiddo. I'm free." And for the first time in months, that was absolutely true. The divorce proceedings began 3 weeks after Clara's arrest, and they were every bit as ugly as I'd expected. Despite her plea agreement, Clara had hired a new attorney, a shark named David Brennan, who specialized in protecting women's rights in high-asset divorces. His strategy seemed to be portraying Clara as the victim of an abusive husband who'd driven her to desperate measures. It might have worked if I hadn't had recordings of Clara discussing my inevitable accident. "Your Honor," Brennan argued during our first hearing, "my client was emotionally and financially abused for years. Mr. Harlow controlled every aspect of her life, leaving her no choice but to take desperate measures to protect herself and her children." Judge Patricia Morrison, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, looked skeptical. "Mr. Brennan, your client is facing federal charges for corporate espionage and fraud. How exactly does that protect her children?" She was manipulated by Mr. Lane, who took advantage of her vulnerable emotional state. I had to hand it to Brennan. He was creative. But Judge Morrison had read the case files. "Mr. Brennan, I have transcripts of recorded conversations in which your client discusses forging documents, stealing proprietary information, and what she termed Mr. Harlow's inevitable accident. This doesn't sound like the behavior of a victim." The hearing went downhill from there. By the end, Clara had been awarded temporary supervised visitation with the children and nothing else. The house, the cars, the bank accounts, everything stayed with me pending the final divorce decree. But Clara wasn't done fighting. 2 days after the hearing, I arrived at TechFlow to find protesters outside the building. About 20 people, mostly women, carrying signs that read, "Justice for Clara" and "Stop Corporate Abuse." Leading the group was Rita, Clara's sister, with a megaphone and a lot of righteous indignation. "Jack Harlow is a corporate bully who destroyed his wife's life," Rita shouted as I walked past. "Clara Harlow is a victim of domestic abuse." I ignored them and went inside, but the protesters stayed all day. They were back the next morning, and the morning after that. The local news picked up the story, framing it as a battle between a powerful businessman and his victimized wife. It was infuriating, but it was also an opportunity. "Let them protest," I told Victor when he suggested calling security. "Every day they're out there, they're reminding people that Clara tried to steal the company, and sooner or later, they're going to do something stupid." I was right. On the 4th day of protests, Rita decided to escalate. Instead of staying on the public sidewalk, she led the group onto TechFlow's private property, blocking the employee entrance and preventing people from getting to work. That's when I called the police. "This is harassment!" Rita screamed as the officers began making arrests. "We have a right to protest!" "You have a right to protest on public property," the lead officer explained patiently. "This is private property, and you're trespassing." The arrests made the evening news, but this time the story was different. Instead of sympathetic victims, the protesters looked like extremists who'd broken the law to harass a business owner. Public opinion began to shift. But the real turning point came when one of the local TV stations decided to do a deeper investigation into Clara's claims of abuse. They interviewed our neighbors, my employees, and several of Clara's former friends. What they found painted a very different picture than the one Brennan was trying to sell. "Jack was always respectful to Clara," said Mrs. Henderson, our next-door neighbor of 10 years. "If anything, she was the one who seemed controlling, always criticizing him, always demanding more money for her projects." "Clara quit her job because she said it was beneath her," said Jennifer Walsh, a former colleague from Clara's law firm. "She used to joke about finding a rich husband so she wouldn't have to work anymore." The most damaging interview came from Sarah Chen, who'd been Clara's best friend before Rita took over that role. "Clara changed when Jack's company became successful," Sarah told the reporter. "She became obsessed with money and status. She used to say that Jack didn't deserve his success because he wasn't sophisticated enough. She thought she could do better." When the story aired, it destroyed Clara's victim narrative completely. The protesters disappeared. Brennan stopped returning reporters' calls, and Clara's plea agreement suddenly looked like the best deal she was going to get. But Simon wasn't ready to give up. Despite his arrest at the tech conference, Simon had made bail and was fighting the charges with a team of expensive lawyers. His strategy seemed to be claiming that everything was Clara's idea, that she'd seduced him and manipulated him into helping her steal from her husband. It was a clever approach, but it had one major flaw. Simon's ego wouldn't let him stay quiet. 3 weeks after his arrest, Simon gave an interview to a business podcast called Entrepreneurial Edge. The host, apparently unaware of Simon's legal troubles, had booked him months earlier to discuss innovative consulting strategies. I listened to the interview with a mixture of amazement and delight. "The problem with most small business owners," Simon said, his voice dripping with condescension, "is that they don't understand scale. They get lucky with one idea and think they're geniuses, but they lack the sophisticated thinking needed to build truly valuable enterprises." "Can you give us an example?" the host asked. "Well, without naming names, I recently worked with a mid-sized tech company where the owner was completely out of his depth, great technical skills, but no business acumen whatsoever. His wife, who had a legal background, could see the potential that he was missing." I nearly choked on my coffee. Simon was essentially confessing to the conspiracy on a podcast that had thousands of listeners. What happened with that situation? Unfortunately, the owner felt threatened by suggestions for improvement. Instead of embracing change, he became paranoid and defensive. It's a common pattern with insecure entrepreneurs. That must have been frustrating. It was tragic, really. The company could have been worth $100 million with proper management. Instead, it's stuck at its current level because the owner is more interested in maintaining control than maximizing value. The interview went on for another 20 minutes, with Simon essentially laying out the entire conspiracy while portraying himself as a misunderstood visionary. By the time it was over, I had enough material to bury him completely. I forwarded the podcast to the FBI, to Clara's prosecutors, and to the civil attorneys handling my lawsuit against Simon. Then, I did something even better. I sent it to every tech journalist in Boston. The response was immediate and brutal. TechCrunch ran a follow-up story titled, "Accused Corporate Spy Confesses on Podcast." The Boston Globe's business section featured an analysis of Simon's admissions. Even the Wall Street Journal picked up the story, framing it as a cautionary tale about corporate espionage in the digital age. Simon's lawyers tried to do damage control, claiming the interview had been taken out of context, but it was too late. His own words had convicted him more effectively than any prosecutor could have. The final blow came when 3 of Simon's previous victims saw the news coverage and decided to file their own lawsuits. Within a week, Simon was facing civil claims totaling $15 million, far more than his leveraged assets could cover. His expensive lawyers dropped him. His bail was revoked after he tried to transfer money to an offshore account, and his luxury lifestyle collapsed like a house of cards. But the most satisfying moment came during Clara's sentencing hearing. Judge Morrison had read all the evidence, listened to all the arguments, and reviewed Clara's plea agreement. When she spoke, her voice was cold with disapproval. "Mrs. Harlow, you have pleaded guilty to conspiracy, fraud, and corporate espionage. These are serious crimes that strike at the heart of our economic system. But what disturbs me most is not just what you did, but how you did it." Clara stood at the defendant's table, her expensive suit and perfect makeup unable to hide the fear in her eyes. "You betrayed not just your husband's trust, but the trust of your children, your community, and everyone who believed in you. You forged documents, stole proprietary information, and conspired with a known criminal to destroy the business your husband built from nothing." Judge Morrison paused, letting the words sink in. "Your attorney has argued that you were manipulated and abused, but the evidence tells a different story. The evidence shows a calculating individual who saw an opportunity for personal gain and pursued it without regard for the consequences to others." Clara's shoulders began to shake. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, she looked genuinely remorseful, or at least genuinely sorry she'd been caught. "Therefore, I sentence you to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. You will also pay restitution in the amount of $2 million to cover the damages to TechFlow Solutions and the costs of the investigation." The gavel came down with a sound like a gunshot. As the bailiffs led Clara away, she turned to look at me one last time. There was no anger in her eyes anymore, no calculation or manipulation. Just the hollow look of someone who'd gambled everything and lost. "I'm sorry," she mouthed. I nodded but said nothing. Sorry didn't undo the betrayal. Sorry didn't repair the damage to our children. Sorry didn't give me back the 18 years I'd spent married to a woman who saw me as nothing more than a means to an end. But sorry was a start. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with Jenna and Max, eating pizza and watching the news coverage of their mother's sentencing. It should have been a moment of triumph, but mostly I felt tired. "Dad," Max said quietly, "are you happy that Mom's going to prison?" It was a fair question, and it deserved an honest answer. "I'm not happy that your mother is going to prison," I said. "I'm sad that she made choices that led to this outcome. But I'm glad that justice was served, and I'm glad that the people who tried to hurt our family are being held accountable for their actions. Do you think she really loved us? Jenna asked. That was a harder question. Clara had been a good mother in many ways, attentive, supportive, involved in the kids' lives. But she'd also been willing to destroy their father and tear apart their family for money. I think your mother loved you in the way she was capable of loving, I said finally. But I also think she loved money and status more than she loved any of us. And that's not your fault. That's hers. We finished our pizza in comfortable silence, 3 survivors of a war we'd never asked to fight. Outside, the reporters were finally packing up their cameras and moving on to the next story. Inside, we were beginning to heal. The war was over. We had won. But the real victory wasn't Clara's prison sentence or Simon's financial ruin. The real victory was sitting at my kitchen table, doing homework and planning for a future that no one could steal from us. That was worth more than any company, any amount of money, or any revenge I could have imagined.